Good morning. This is Mercy Russell of the Remarkable Relationship Show. My goal is to bring a fresh perspective to you on all things related to how humans develop their individual brilliance while navigating the excitement, stickiness, and resistance in their relationships. In my 40 years of working as a psychotherapist and consultant, I have been continually amazed at the ways in which people overcome challenges. I hope to share my experience and insights so you can find the magic in your relationships. So, good morning. I'm here today with my guest, Emily Morrow. Emily is a dear friend who brings us her story of reinventing herself professionally and personally and culturally. A highly successful estate attorney, Emily retired in 2005 at the age 2004 at the age of 52. As she began a consulting practice, she and her physician husband decided to build a second home overseas. After a stint in Sydney, Australia, they moved to Auckland, New Zealand. We are going to talk about her experiences making this brave move, her talent for building community, and her personal transformation. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Mercy. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you. So let's start with some background of your life in Vermont where we met. What motivated you to retire and your decision to seek a second home overseas? That's sort of a big chapter. But let's give some background for our audience.
Sure. So I graduated from law school in the late 1970s. And after a couple of interim moves, my husband and I moved to Vermont, where he had grown up. We moved into the family home and we're settled there for almost 25 years. And I was a partner and a senior partner and then managing partner at a large law firm there, and built and managed a successful trust and estates practice, and that was all good. And then September 11th occurred in 2001. And I remember coming home and thinking to myself that the US was going to go through a fundamental change as a result of this experience. Interestingly, my husband, who's a forensic pathologist, within a couple of hours of that event, he was mobilized to go down to New York City to help with victim identification. So I was home in Vermont for about 2 weeks by myself while he was down in New York working. And I had a lot of time to kind of think about the implications of this event. And to be honest, I didn't have any fears about terrorism in Burlington, Vermont. But I had some concerns about the US and its reaction to this event. And I had concerns as I watched the aftermath of September 11th about the sort of clear growth in what appeared to me to be xenophobia and also nationalism, both of which concerned me because those typically are trends that are not particularly helpful for a country. So that was one factor that got me to begin to think about building a life in a country other than the United States. Another factor was that we had been to New Zealand. We loved the country. New Zealand is a beautiful place. And so it was appealing to think about moving there. New Zealand, I think it's a small, benign, friendly country with culturally, in some ways, not too dissimilar to Vermont. So in any event, I decided at that point, I decided that I was ready to quit the practice of law. My husband who was the chief medical examiner at the time, he decided that he was ready to leave that position. And we didn't retire, although you might say that our philosophy of life is retire early and often. So you could call this the first of many retirements, but I really thought of it more as the R word being reinvention of self rather than retirement. And so anyway, he was able to get a job first in Australia and then in Auckland. And in 2005, August of 2005, we packed up. We each had two suitcases. We rolled them out of the house and we, trundled off to Sydney. So that was the beginning of that new life abroad.
Mhm. Yes, when I think of your time in Sydney, one of the first things I think about, I just want to talk a little bit more about your background, your
Oh,
professional,
sure.
so people have a sense of, um, just we're going to be talking about community, but you were very embedded in we were in Burlington, Vermont,
Yeah.
and you were very embedded in that community. And I'm going to ask you a little bit about it, but the anecdote I remember is you telling me, really with some glee, that you had gone to a ladies' luncheon of basically, I can't remember, some type of, expat international
Yeah.
wives
Yeah.
luncheon.
In Sydney.
Like,
In Sydney.
right. Like
Yeah.
this was such an unusual type of thing for you to be doing in the context of your career. So can you just tell people a little bit about what the scope of your practice was and what the
Sure.
kind of
Sure.
community
Well,
involvement you had?
yeah. So I did trust and estate work, and my clientele were, to be honest, kind of the rich and famous in Vermont, because they were the ones who needed estate planning. And I was on and chaired many boards, including the board of the largest commercial bank in Vermont. And historically, my work and my community involvement had been in the context of doing things that women typically don't do, like back then, like chairing bank boards and being in leadership roles of a variety of types. So anyway, when we went to Sydney, I didn't know a soul. So didn't know a soul. And so I was open to any and all offers. And I was introduced to this organization called the Sydney Women's International Club. And the vast majority of the members were the wives of successful executives who had lived overseas, and they were the classic bonbon eaters and ladies who lunch. And I had never spent time in my life with women like this. So it was kind of a cross-cultural experience. And they didn't quite know what to make about with me, because my professional background was I'd actually had a career. They had often gone to university, but they'd never had a career. Their primary talents were raising children and cooking great meals, and neither of those are my great talents. So.
Well, you are really, though, a very graceful and skilled entertainer. So,
well, you're kind.
It's very true. So, but then from there, you really platformed, because this theme of this is community building, and I have just been watching you carefully, but you really platformed that kind of easy entry. Maybe it was, interesting and unusual for you, but you then began to make connections with the husbands when you had sort of, or mixed events. And that took you in a direction for your sort of your second career.
Well, and what had happened was I had been interested and had applied to and gotten accepted into a master's degree program at the University of Sydney in executive coaching. And I was all set to embark on that training. And then actually the husband of one of these women, I had lunch with him and I was talking with him, and he gave me an introduction to a woman who ran a national consultancy company in Australia. And I had lunch with her. And so she asked me about my background. I filled her in about that. So she looked at me and she said, why in God's name are you going into this master's program? You already have a doctorate. Why do you need this master's? I'll hire you to do consultancy work with lawyers and law firms who are our clients here in Australia, and we'll put you to work right away. I said, oh, okay. She said, if you don't like it, well, then go back and do the master's program. So I ditched the master's program and went to work with her firm, all of which worked well. And that got me started on this second career of doing consulting work for lawyers and law firms, which is something that I've continued to do here in New Zealand.
Right. So you were working with a firm, and they had a, what would you say?
They had an IP. They had their IP, how they worked with people.
IP,
Intellectual property.
intellectual property, right?
Right.
So
they had their modus operandi of how they.
yeah, they had a protocol for how they
Yeah.
worked with clients.
Yeah.
And part of that involved pitching an offer, sort of sales. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Was that something you'd had to do much before?
Oh yes, I mean I built a law practice from scratch.
Right.
So I've always been very entrepreneurial about building a professional practice. It's something that I enjoy doing. And so this was the same, I used the same approach, albeit in a different sector, being the consulting sector rather than in the practice of law. But yeah, same relationship building, networking, building professional profile within a cohort of prospective clients and referrers.
Mm-hmm. So you were involved not only in working with clients that they brought in, but part of your job was also to bring in clients.
Yes, yeah.
And
which was fine.
Right, which was kind of what would you say? A basic skill of yours that you had, cultivated in developing your practice.
I mean, I love that business development component of a professional practice. To me, that's in some ways the most fun.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Interesting. Because it varies a lot for different professionals. In terms of my professional, when I think of my father's medical career, he was always just very reliant on his competence. Right.
Yes.
And so it was not about him. I mean, obviously there was natural networking that took place in a small town. He was in a relatively small town. And, but to him, it was not something you ever thought about doing or did purposely. Like he just relied, it was very much sort of merit based. You meet me, you see what I do. And I don't think the word marketing ever crossed, or networking ever crossed his mind. So all to say, that is a particular approach of yours. And do you find that many lawyers have that?
Well, it's a good question, Mercy. I would say the vast majority don't. And part of that is just the temperament profile of the typical person who goes into the law. They often can be relatively introverted. They're interested in the law rather than relationship building. So one of the things that I do a lot of work in now with lawyers, in terms of the consulting work I do, is working with people on developing business development capabilities, because increasingly law firms are putting pressure on their people before they'll make them partners to demonstrate that they can build a partner level practice and meet the financial goals the firm has for them.
And bring in clients. Yeah. So, yeah.
Bring in that fresh meat.
Now, I won't stoop so low as to credit your extroversion for that, because I really do think it's a skill. But I do notice, how enlivened you are, when you're just reaching out and getting to know people. But it's an important skill for anyone to have.
I think the other thing I love to do, and I've loved to do this ever since I was a kid, I love to do public speaking. Just love it.
Yeah.
Put me up in front of a group of people, I have a blast.
So you would not be, it's really interesting when they study stress and anxiety and the physiology. One of the things that they can do, there are a couple things. They use these goggles with people in Shark Tank. So sharks and public speaking.
I know.
So you, in a sense, would be an anomaly in that.
I would be.
Because it's really almost not universal, but very widespread that people get anxious with public speaking.
Yeah. No, I love it.
You've always loved it.
I have.
Yeah. And you've used public speaking as part of networking. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Public speaking, one-on-one relationship building, public speaking, networking, and social media.
And tell me about the social media.
Well, it's actually relatively straightforward. It's having a good website. It's having being active on LinkedIn. It's remaining in touch with people through email, sending them information that they might have that would be of interest to them. And I think in terms of a website, that an effective website is one that is fairly short and crisp and professional, not a lot of ancillary information about you as a person, but more you as a professional. That seems to work well, at least for lawyers.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And one that's got good search engine optimization.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Great. So then what happened with that experience in Sydney with the consultancy?
Well, I did that for 3 years, and then
Uh-huh.
and that was fine. But it became clear to my husband and I after about 3 years that Australia was not the place we wanted to be. And he was offered a job in Auckland, which is in New Zealand, which is the place we had wanted to be at the outset. So although I had enjoyed that consultancy work with that firm, I was looking forward to being freelance and not being subject to the constraints of a larger organization about what I did and how I did it.
Right.
So when we got to Auckland, I had a very fortunate break. I happened
before we go on, I wanted
sure.
to stay back in Sydney for a bit, because we're going to talk about New Zealand and and what it's like. I think I love hearing you talk about that. But what was it like in Sydney, and what was your personal social life there like? In terms of your sort of natural community building. That's just the way you move in the world. What happened in Sydney with that?
Well, that organization, in some ways, strangely enough, became the basis, that Sydney Women's International Club, even though I was a bit of a fish out of water within it. I did meet some interesting women, and I think there's a process of culling in an organization like that, where you, over time, identify the like-minded people. And you contact them individually, and you do things one-on-one, and you have them over for dinner and that kind of thing. And I've always found that one of the best ways to build relationships in a new community is have people over for dinner. Kind of goes back to that Christian notion of sharing bread together. And I always do that. I've always enjoyed that. And some of those professional relationships morphed into friendships as well.
In that. Interesting. So, but the primary decision had to do with also with Paul's career, with your husband's career, and just seeing. And then also wasn't there sort of more of a problem getting a visa?
Oh, yes. Well, we were interested in getting permanent residency and ultimately citizenship. And the New Zealand Forensic Pathology Licensing Board was making it difficult for my husband. And he got sort of sick of, he could have done it ultimately, but he got sick of the process.
Right. Yeah. It's a tough thing when you've been the chief medical examiner of the state, to have to kind of jump through those hoops.
Exactly.
So it's time for us to take a break, and we're going to take a break. We'll be back in just a few minutes. This is Mercy Russell with the Remarkable Relationship Show, and my guest today is Emily Morrow, who is a retired attorney and executive coach and consultant. And we'll be talking about her personal transformation and reinvention when we come back.
Alternative Talk 1150 is your sports organization's safe bet when it comes to airing your team's games. Our players are all seasoned professionals when it comes to sports programming. Imagine your games being heard on local radio. Your team deserves the MVP treatment. Call 425-653-1150 today to learn how affordable and fun it is to broadcast your games on the radio. Call 425-653-1150 and make your next season something special. That's 425-653-1150.
Hi, tune into my new show, The Remarkable Relationship Show, with me, Mercy Russell. I bring a fresh perspective on all things related to how humans develop their individual brilliance while navigating the excitement, stickiness, and resistance in their relationships. Wednesdays from 9 to 10 a.m., and you can visit my website at leadershipwithmercy.com.
You pledged your life to serve, to make our country stronger, safer, more free, more equal. You worked tirelessly, made sacrifices, missed first steps and birthdays, lost loved ones. At VA, we don't see the setbacks endured. We see lessons applied and passion driving you upward and forward. We don't see all the masks you wear, but we hope you can set some aside. We embrace your uniqueness and won't trivialize your past, your fears, or your hardships. We can't promise to heal all wounds or wash away all trauma, but we do see hope, a path forward, a future. We see all veterans. We see you, an opportunity to help you achieve a new mission, whatever that may be. Learn how treatment works and recovery is possible. Visit maketheconnection.net.
Talk radio with a purpose. Alternative Talk 1150.
Hello, Mercy Russell is here with the Remarkable Relationship Show. I'm here today with my guest, Emily Morrow, and we're talking about her reinvention of self. We've just been talking about her first career and life in Vermont, Shelburne, Vermont, and Burlington, Vermont, and her move to Sydney, Australia. And now, Emily, I want to talk about your move to New Zealand, where you currently live.
Okay.
So you and your husband had decided that Sydney was really not a place where you could stay.
Yeah. Well, it was just, it was culturally too different to Vermont. Australia and New Zealand could not be more different to each other. And living in Sydney was a lot of fun. It's a lovely, fun city, but it's more like living in Houston, Texas. And Australia is a dry, harsh climate, and we came from a lush green place being Vermont. And ultimately the environmental and cultural differences were just too stark for us.
Well, can you just spell out a little bit more, like what about Houston?
What about Sydney? Well, it's
Sydney and Houston.
Yeah, it's a very big city. It's very brash. It's quite intense. And I would say, and I liked Australia, but I would say that the climate and to some extent the people are harsh. Whereas I would say in New Zealand, the climate and the people are pretty benign. We used to joke about Australia and say the reality of Australia is that what you don't know in Australia is likely to kill you. I mean, they have just the number of poisonous plants and creatures and fish and jellyfish, and whereas in New Zealand there's nothing poisonous.
Oh, how interesting. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, such a different ecosystem.
Completely different. Most people don't appreciate that.
Right. And there is that air. I mean, this is just very superficial on my part because I don't know much about Australia, but just the air that as the Westerners who came and settled there weren't they were convicts,
right?
It
was transports. It was very dark, very, very dark history.
Right.
And in New Zealand, the people who settled here came here for a better life. So, and it was settled during a different time in the British Empire.
Right.
And Australia has one of the darkest histories of any country that I know, including how it was settled, its treatment of its Aboriginal people.
Mm-hmm.
And in New Zealand, basically our Indigenous people are alive and well, and the culture is strong, and it's a very, very different situation.
Right. They have a dynamic citizenry. This whole one of my favorite books about American patterns of immigration is called Albion Seed, and there are other people who've written about this, but how the culture in different parts of our country, which actually can sort of mirror some of those differences, are linked to where the immigrants were coming from. So this makes total sense to me, and I certainly would love to hear more about New Zealand in that respect. But right now, I want to talk about your move to New Zealand. Now, did this primarily have to do with Paul? I know hadn't you had your eye on New Zealand originally?
Oh yes, we had. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That was the country we had wanted to move to. But at the time we were ready to make the move, there wasn't a job available in New Zealand. And then a job became available, and Paul applied for that and was hired. So that gave us the possibility. And it was through his skills that we were ultimately able to get permanent residency and then citizenship in New Zealand, which we've done.
Because he then went to work for the city of Auckland.
Well, for the local hospital. Yeah. For
the local hospital as a forensic pathologist. And he's done some different things since he's been there, right? So
he's always been a forensic pathologist,
right?
But he keeps retiring and then getting rehired. They won't let him retire because his skills are in such demand.
All right.
Yeah,
for sure. And he did get a master's in public health, right?
He did. Yes. Just a couple of years ago, he went back and got a master's in public health. And not to be bested, I'm in the process of going back and getting a master's in counseling at the University of Auckland. I mean, I've got to keep up with the Joneses here.
Can't let your husband have more degrees than you do.
I'm a strong believer, and gotta keep growing and developing. So
well, that's a nice joke, but I know that's not the motivation. So you arrived in New Zealand, and you were originally in a high-rise in Auckland.
We were, and I just hated that. So fairly quickly we got ourselves out of there and moved to a suburb of Auckland called Devonport, which is a lovely little suburb across the harbor. And so once again, I was fortunate. I'd gotten some introductions to people in Auckland from people that I knew in Sydney. There's quite a bit of cross-pollination. And fairly soon along, I got to know a professional colleague who gave me an introduction to one of the larger law firms in the country to start doing one-on-one coaching work for their people. So that it turned out to be relatively easy to develop an individual consultancy practice. So all that's worked well. But I would say that the networking skills that I used in Sydney and also in Vermont were very helpful here. I mean, it's kind of like I'm like a duck in water. You put me in the water and I'll just start swimming around and meeting the other ducks. What I find is extremely helpful in that regard is just to ask people about themselves and listen.
Yeah,
people are interested in telling you their stories. As a friend of mine who used to do, she did image consulting for people, and she once made the comment. She said, "The most charming person is the best listener."
Yes. Yeah. Well, this is, it's I think now talked about widely as in dating, and I mean all kinds of things that I read. Is the important thing is to be the listener.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, it's a skill to be practiced, right? And
Uh-huh.
so not everybody is just a natural at that. And so so you moved to Devonport, right?
Uh-huh.
And you bought a home there.
Uh-huh.
And then how did what other type of community activities were you involved with in the beginning? I
Yeah.
know they've expanded since then, but
Well, I joined the local Rotary Club,
mhm,
and I was interested. I have been on and off various nonprofit boards in New Zealand. And we joined one of the local churches. And I would say of the different modalities that we use to build
mhm,
community, I would say joining the church, which is a very community-based church, has probably been the most rich and fulfilling of those.
so interesting.
Yeah.
And it's a church of a different faith than the one that you were raised in.
Yes, it's an Anglican
Yeah.
church. Yeah.
Mhm,
Yeah. And it's very much community based, so that essentially everybody in the church lives within 5 minutes of the church. So everywhere you go in the community, Devonport's a fairly small community. Everywhere you
mhm,
go, you run into people from the church.
from the church.
Yeah, which is lovely.
Yeah.
Been
So
lovely.
it's uh-huh.
And then, and
And
I tend
what
in. Oh
since
yeah.
I would say, I don't know if this is fair to say, but
Uh-huh.
you correct me otherwise, but initially, at any rate, I wouldn't have called you a religious person.
This is true.
So can you talk more about yes, you met people and you build community, but there was more to that community that had significance and meaning for you. Can you talk a
Yes.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, at the time we were going through some difficult things in our family in particular, and I had reached kind of a dead end in terms of my ability to deal with some of those things, let's say.
Mhm.
And I just was drawn on some level to go to the church. I went for a midnight mass one Christmas Eve, and really, really liked what was going on at that church. It's a traditional Anglican church. I mean, it's not anything kind of out of the
Right.
ordinary.
And
Uh,
just for
yeah.
for Americans, now my grandmother actually was from an Anglican tradition, and
Uh-huh.
she went to the Episcopalian church.
Of course,
So
that'd be
in
the
the
U.S.
United,
version.
yeah, that would be the U.S. version. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So you
One of the
liked
things.
what?
Oh,
Mhm.
go ahead.
No, but you liked what you experienced when you first
Absolutely.
went.
I like the leadership. Our vicar is great, wonderful woman. And I tend, whenever I get involved with an organization, this is just me, I tend to get involved in a leadership capacity. So I was invited to go on to vestry, and now I am what's known as the vicar's warden.
Mhm. Can you
So,
explain what those are
well,
to our
vestry is the
audience?
governing body of the church.
Uh-huh.
And the vicar's warden is essentially the person who is the confidant and the person with whom the vicar can talk candidly about difficult things that are going on in the parish in a confidential way, kind of the support person for the vicar.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, which has been great. It's been a wonderful
Right. Well,
experience.
yeah. And
Yeah.
who better suited, right? I mean, from my point of view.
Yeah.
And you have that you also started going on retreats with the church. So you were,
Yes.
you were
Yeah.
developing sort of more in-depth relationships
Yeah.
with other
Yeah, that's a
congregants.
good point. I think if you're going, my philosophy tends to be, if you're going to be a bear, be a grizzly. I mean, don't do something unless you're going to do a good job with it. And
Mhm.
if it doesn't feel like you can commit yourself to that and doing a good job with it, then don't bother. Step away from it.
Yeah, so you dove in.
Yes.
You really took what
Yes.
was offered and you took advantage and
Mhm.
you also developed relationships with other families
Yes.
in
Yes.
in the
Yep.
community, in the church. And then again, this is so interesting. Both of us coming from the Vermont, which is really a, a, a state of small communities.
Yeah.
Even we lived in Burlington, Vermont, Shelburne, which is probably the largest, most populous, city, and yet it's still a small community in the end.
Yeah.
Where you walk down the street, you're always going to see someone.
See people. Well, I remember a Kiwi friend of mine, a lawyer actually, said to me, as she's a lawyer in Auckland, and she said to me as I was building this consultancy practice, she said, you have to understand about New Zealand, that New Zealand is like a small village, and Auckland is a neighborhood in that village, and all the lawyers are an extended family in that village. That's how things operate here, and it really is true. I mean, New Zealand is a country of 5 million people, and there are no secrets in New Zealand. and like Vermont, it's a place where if you want to meet somebody for whatever reason, they're only at the most they're 2 degrees of separation. You can get access to that person very easily, and it's a very, I would say, it's a very high functioning, well integrated community. With like Vermont, it's got a high level of social capital. Yeah, it's a pretty wonderful place.
What do you mean by that, a high level of social capital?
Well, social capital is that kind of amorphous and yet ubiquitous element, if you will, that creates the stickiness and sense of cohesion within a community. And it manifests itself in many both obvious and less obvious ways. So, for example, in a state like Vermont, which has high levels of social capital, and I'm referencing here the work of Robert, I think it's Robert Putnam, who wrote the book. Yeah, who wrote the book Bowling Alone. That there are a lot of indicia of high levels of social capital, everything from higher rates of graduation from high school to lower teen pregnancy rates to less poverty and better health outcomes and all of that stuff.
Right. And the distinction by it as social capital is that it has to do with not so much your financial status or your material status. It has to do with your connections to other people.
Yes, that's your social capital.
And your stature, in a sense.
Yes.
In your community and in your network. And your stature could have to do with, the way you organize church suppers, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to do with necessarily a prestigious role in the community. It really has to
it could have to do that, but the thing is, when you move to an entirely new country and a new community, you have no history. Nobody knows whether you're an honest person or a dishonest person, a trustworthy one or a toxic one. And so you have to rebuild that identity from scratch through cumulative and iterative interactions with other people, in which you rise to the occasion and meet, if not exceed, their expectations.
Right.
So in some ways, one of the things that I have found so very interesting about living overseas, well, it's twofold. One is that I think it requires you for me, it requires me to be the best person I can day to day, because I'm always every time I open my mouth, I announce that I'm from away, just because of my accent.
Because of your accent, that's true.
So when I meet somebody new, they may be bringing some expectations to that interaction, and I need to manage myself in a way that my best self is the one that comes forward, and yet the authentic self. And secondly, the other part I love about it is that every day something is new and different. That every day I'll bump up against some cultural difference that I perhaps didn't even realize was there.
Right. I remember the year I lived, I lived in France for a year, but then I went back like 8 years later, and I was there for about 4 months by myself. And I remember, feeling really quite isolated. And I was there working on a dissertation, so wasn't out and about all day, but I often had to go out, and of course I had that other language, which was still
Sure.
somewhat of a challenge, although I was confident. But I would tell myself at the beginning of every day, something interesting is going to happen today. At the
Uh-huh.
end of the day, you're going to be you're going to be able to look back and see something that surprised you. And it was always
Mhm.
positive. There was
Mm.
always something curious or positive or an interesting interaction with somebody, but I could count on it. So it became my mantra in the beginning of the day. And it was really sort of the antidote to feeling kind of isolated and um, I would feel afraid of walking out the door. I'd have to
Yeah,
say, Mercy, I say, Mercy, come on, this is okay. Everything's going to be
you can do
fine.
this.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, but I had to talk myself into it. It was so I think that experience is really fascinating. We're at the point of taking another break and then I want to come back and really I want you to tell us more about New Zealand. You've told me a lot, and I want to try to explore more of
Mm.
that for our listeners so that they really get a much more, nuanced view of the culture, of the way that it works, of how things, what your experience has been like, especially since you've been there and we've been through COVID there. And then also your personal transformation, right?
Uh-huh.
You're a different person now. Now you're not particularly different to me, but I know you've had a lot of experiences that are, have really changed the way you see the world. And I'd like to talk more about that. So this is Mercy Russell with the Remarkable Relationship Show. My guest, Emily Morrow, and we'll be back after the break.
Have something important to say? Want to help improve our world? Need to promote your business uniquely and effectively? KKNW is the answer. Our staff helps broadcasters and podcasters create professional sounding audio. Bring your talent and let our experts help you craft a radio show or podcast that best delivers your message. Learn more at 1150kknw.com. That's 1150kknw.com. KKNW, talk variety that's live and local.
Hi, tune into my new show, The Remarkable Relationship Show, with me, Mercy Russell. I bring a fresh perspective on all things related to how humans develop their individual brilliance while navigating the excitement, stickiness, and resistance in their relationships. Wednesdays from 9 to 10 a.m., and you can visit my website at leadershipwithmercy.com.
Multicultural, multidimensional even. Alternative Talk 1150.
Hello, this is Mercy Russell with the Remarkable Relationship Show. I'm here today with my guest, Emily Morrow, and we're talking about reinvention of self. Emily and I met in Vermont. She then moved to Sydney, Australia, and then she now lives in New Zealand with her second home in Vermont still. And we're talking about her life in New Zealand. So, Emily, we were just talking about basically how you connected to the small community, the Devonport, which is part, I guess part of the city of Auckland,
It is,
or
yeah,
contiguous to
it's a
it. Yes.
suburb.
Yeah, it's a small community and a church that you've been very involved with there on many levels. Yeah, always a leader, a soul sister, sort of. Yeah, you've really kind of,
Mm.
embraced that. And but you and I have spoken regularly throughout this journey, and I have really been fascinated with your view of New Zealand. as a country, as a culture. And certainly we talk about it in contrast to some of our feelings and experiences in the United States. So I just liked you to talk a little bit more about that. And let's see, where should we start? I guess one place I'd like to start is just what we referred to in our conversation about Sydney and the relationship between the Western immigrants and settlers onto the island with the native or Aboriginal people. And which has been a kind of a harsh history in Australia and
dark one, very, very dark.
Dark in the United States as well. Tell us more about what it has been like in New Zealand and how that is active in the culture today.
Yeah. Well, it's not like it's a bright and happy history in New Zealand. On the other hand, when the Crown arrived and started actively colonizing New Zealand in the 1830s and 1840s, it was considerably later than when they were doing that in Sydney. And Maori being our indigenous people, they are big, strong people. They're Polynesians. They're physically very robust, and they're warriors. And what happened in New Zealand is that there were years of conflict between the Crown and Maori, and across the country. And in 1840, essentially, Maori fought the Brits to a truce, to a standstill, which resulted in what's called the Treaty of Waitangi. And the Treaty of Waitangi was a written document that attempted to codify the relationship between the Crown and between Maori. And that document continues to be the seminal legal document to this day that is referred to whenever there are issues around the relative rights and responsibilities of the Crown and now the government in New Zealand and Maori. And Maori are strong people, and they're bright people, and they learned the ways of the Europeans. They learned how to use European weapons. They're highly effective people. Now, it's been a difficult history, and there were periods of time in New Zealand where Maori were almost exterminated, as in other colonization stories. The focus now in New Zealand, however, at the present time, and I find this very, very exciting, is about creating a bicultural country in New Zealand and a bilingual country. So the Maori language is te reo. And there's been a very big push to teach te reo in school. And in fact, there's such a demand, not just among Maori, but also among Pakeha. Pakeha are the Europeans, to learn te reo, that there's a shortage of te reo teachers. And there's been a real effort to integrate what's known as tikanga Maori. Tikanga Maori is Maori custom into the way things happen in New Zealand. And Maori are a strong political force in New Zealand as well. So that, for example, in the election in which Jacinda Ardern and her government came into power, it was primarily because of a Maori smaller party that threw the power to Jacinda. So Maori are a very important force in this country. So that's one factor. I think another factor that differentiates New Zealand, say, from the US, and I think also from Australia, and there's a book that's been written about this. There's a wonderful book, I forget the name of the author, called Freedom and Fairness. And the thesis of this book is that the core value in the United States, for a whole lot of reasons, is around personal freedom. The development of the West, and don't tread on my freedoms. The core value in New Zealand is fairness. And it's the value around, if everybody can't have it, then nobody should have it. And that core value drives a lot of things. It's behind our national healthcare system. It's behind New Zealand. One of the fascinating aspects of New Zealand that's not well known is that we have no personal injury litigation in New Zealand. No personal injury litigation. So if you're injured in a malpractice situation or you're injured in a car accident, there's no fault. What happens is that your remedy is through a government-sponsored program called ACC that provides you with whatever resources, whether they be medical or supportive or whatever, to get you back into health. So the implications of this are that the doctors don't have to worry about malpractice litigation. And it's kind of interesting because there are lots of lawyers in New Zealand, and they earn a good living without being involved in malpractice litigation. Or personal injury litigation.
Interesting.
So there are lots of implications of this. Another just kind of quick and dirty one-liner that I'll say to people will often from the US will say, well, how is New Zealand and how are New Zealand and the US different? And I'll say to them, well, you know, in the US, consumer goods are inexpensive, easy to get, of great variety, and high quality. But the public and municipal infrastructure is falling apart. Whereas in New Zealand, consumer goods are expensive, hard to get, often of low quality and a poor variety, but our public and municipal infrastructure, it's not perfect, but it's in pretty good shape because that's where the investment goes. So it's very, very different culturally. And I've certainly known Americans who have come to live in New Zealand for whom it wasn't the right fit because they missed that very strong consumer culture that they were used to in the US.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah.
And it's, and the, and so what was your experience then? Now, Jacinda, you've talked to me quite a bit about Jacinda, so I'm familiar with who she is. When did she come into office? And she was a very distinctive leader through the COVID pandemic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about her? And
she and her Labor Party came into power about 5 years ago and have had she has managed a series of really potentially destabilizing crises in that 5-year period. COVID, the massacre in Christchurch, a volcanic eruption that killed a lot of people here in New Zealand. And during COVID, it became very clear that New Zealand had one chance to do COVID right the first time because our medical resources were fairly modest compared to many other countries. I mean, in the whole country of New Zealand, there were maybe 200 ventilators at the time COVID broke out. And when you're located at the end of the world, like we are, hours from anywhere else, you can't just order more ventilators when you run out. So Jacinda very quickly, and I think to her great credit, decided to play the only card New Zealand had, which was isolation and lockdown. So literally after we'd gotten only a few COVID cases, but COVID got here later. So we had the advantage of seeing what happened in the rest of the world. But very, very quickly, Jacinda put us into a very intense lockdown and basically pretty much stopped international travel and created a system of what were called managed isolation and quarantine facilities, so that anybody coming from overseas had to go into a government-run quarantine facility for 2 weeks. And so the effect was in the first wave of COVID that COVID was eliminated in the country. And during the time when COVID was spreading really everywhere else in the world, for that year, we lived a pretty normal, albeit insulated, life of being COVID free. It was almost surreal sometimes.
I do want to move on because I have another important question for you, but I just want to mention this vignette you told me about. What we haven't talked about is, that you are a lifelong open water swimmer. She swims as long as there isn't ice on the water, she's in Lake Champlain, suited up, and then in the pool, and then you swim in the ocean where you I do nearby when it's seasonable. And I had a story about, you weren't even supposed to go swimming during COVID.
You're right.
Right?
Yeah.
But one day you did.
Oh, this was a great anecdote. Yeah, so they basically during the lockdown to avoid having um, medical problems because of somebody drowning or whatever, their swimming was off limits. But a friend and I were we decided we were going to swim anyway. So we went out at 7 o'clock in the morning to what we thought was a fairly isolated beach where nobody would see us, and we started doing our laps. Well, there was one house at the end of this beach. And after a couple of days of doing this elderly man, he must have been well into his 80s, hobbled out of the house on a cane, came to the beach where we were, and yelled at us, "You're letting Jacinda and the team of 5 million down. Now get out of the water. Get out of the water." And he shamed us. He didn't threaten to call the police or anything like that. He said, "You are letting Jacinda and the team of 5 million down." And I thought that was brilliant. I wanted to go and shake his hand.
Probably they didn't want you close, but I love
yeah.
that story. I mean, it's so unique, really. And in terms of, I think that there are pockets in the United States that were operating like that, but it certainly didn't mark our country, that spirit, right?
Yeah.
Emily, I want to see if we can dive a little deeper into talking about your personal transformation. We've been talking about how you do things, how you've done them differently, what kinds of activities have influenced you, but how would you begin to talk about how you're different today than you were, it's over 15 years ago, right?
Yeah. That's again a great question. I would say that when I was a lawyer, I was just very focused on accomplishing things. And since we've moved over here, I would say I'm a lot more focused on just being. And there have been a couple of health-related experiences during the course of the last 15 years that have impacted that, I would say. One is that I was diagnosed with cancer. And that's a pretty humbling thing to go from what you feel is brilliant health into being in a situation where you're really debilitated by not so much the disease, but by the treatment. And then several years ago, I turned out that I needed a repair of my mitral valve. So I had open heart surgery. Again, I went from being this very robust, capable person to being, very, very dependent. So I would say this has probably made, this plus, I guess, involvement in the church has certainly made me more introspective and perhaps a little bit more of an observer, a little less of a doer.
How has your faith changed?
How shall I put this? We were Quakers initially, and I think the basic tenet of Quakerism is that there is that of God in every person. And I would say that precept, that religious, if you will, faith-based precept has not changed for me. And it has implications about how you interact with other people and how you manage yourself in life. The Christianity, I view Christianity and the Anglican Church and the doctrines of the Anglican Church in a metaphorical way. I don't view them in a literal way. And the basic tenets of Christianity viewed through that metaphorical lens make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I was raised. My mother particularly was very clear that the Bible was, that the lessons were a metaphor, right? And that there was deeper meaning in the stories, that they weren't literal. So that's really
I say, Christianity is not for people who are metaphorically challenged.
I don't know if it's not. I don't know. Anyway, we could go into that about. It's pretty challenging if you take it literally too. So, I just want to say, you talked about, doing versus being. When you and I met was during that period. I mean, we met beforehand, but we really got to know each other. I was hobbling around with a debilitated hip, and you were
I was going through cancer
you were
treatment.
going through cancer treatment, and it was in the winter, and
Oh.
I'd come and we'd sit and talk, and we really got to know each other. And that was a period of being. That was really a period of being.
Oh, it was.
So I've always known you as someone. I sometimes describe you in a comparable way to people as somebody who's, a girlfriend, just in the moment, enjoying, having fun. And then you just have to watch out, because the next thing she's got her,
I've got my agenda.
You got your agenda, you got your lawyer face on, you're like,
Yeah,
whoa,
yeah.
wait a minute, who is this person? And I love it because it's so almost seamless, at least for me, and having
Yeah,
known you for so
yeah.
long. So even as you are being more and more, you are still doing a lot.
Yeah.
And it's almost seamless, because the being becomes more part of the doing. And
Yeah.
and I think that's really the goal. True. It's not
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
eating bonbons, right? Emily, our time is up, and I thank you so much for joining me today. This is always a pleasure to talk to you, and it's been very generous of you to give your time to me. This is Mercy Russell with the Remarkable Relationship Show. Our guest today on the show is Emily Morrow from New Zealand and Burlington, Vermont, and this has been her story of reinvention of self and community building. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Mercy. Thank you.
Emily. Thank you.